Module 5, Objective 2, sketch and label the structure of a typical neuron, describe the functions of each component, and classify neurons on the basis of their structure and function. Neural tissue contains two main types of cells. We have neurons. These are cells that generate and send, as well as receive signals, electrical signals. And if you remember, we've already identified those electrical signals as being named action potentials. The other main cell type within neural tissue are the neuroglial cells, or glial cells, and these are supportive cells. They're cells that support the neurons. Neurons are the basic functional units of the nervous system. They function in communication, they process information, as well as control. And like any cell, you would anticipate neurons to have a cell body, or soma. They have large nuclei as well as nucleoli. The cytoplasm of the neuron is called the perikaryon. They have mitochondria as well as all the normal organelles that you would anticipate. So the rough endoplasmic reticula, the ribosomes, Golgi apparati, so on and so forth. Neurons have a number of extensions off the cell body, and the shorter extensions are the dendrites. Dendrology is the study of trees, and these dendrites look like branches to early anatomists, so they named them the dendrite. These are short, highly branched processes that extend from the cell body. Dendritic spines are the fine processes on the dendrites themselves, and you can see here in this micrograph all of these dendritic spines on the dendrites. They receive information from other neurons, and 80 to 90% of the surface area of the neuron is found within these dendritic spines. Normally, neurons have a single long cytoplasmic process called the axon, and it's the role of the axon to propagate the electrical signal or the action potential down the length from the cell body to the end. The cytoplasm of the axon is called the axoplasm, and the membrane, the plasma membrane of the axon, is the axolemma. The first segment of the axon is referred to as the axon hillock, and we see that right here in this figure. It's a very thick section of the cell body, and it attaches to the initial segment of the axon. At the end of the axon, we have the collaterals. These are branches of the axon, and they're going to end in the teleodendria. These are the fine extensions of the distal axons. The teleodendria ultimately give rise to the axon terminals. And we've already seen this in the previous module. This is where the neurotransmitters are maintained so that the message could be transmitted from one cell to the next. The synapse is the junction between the neuron and whatever comes next. In Module 4, we talked about the neuromuscular junction, the junction between the neuron and the skeletal muscle fiber. But those two components constitute the synapse. This is an area where a neuron communicates with another cell. When we talk about a synapse, and I'm going to draw a very crude representation of an axon. Here's your cell body. There's your axon, and here's your axon terminal. And I'm going to draw a second neuron. So here we have two neurons, and here is our synapse, the junction between these two neurons. When we talk about this synapse, this cell is the presynaptic cell, making this cell the postsynaptic cell. It's pre-synapse. It's before the synapse, while the postsynaptic cell is after the synapse. The presynaptic cell sends the message. The postsynaptic cell receives the message. In between the two is the synaptic cleft, that physical gap that separates the presynaptic membrane from the postsynaptic membrane. The synaptic knob is an expanded area of the axon of the presynaptic neuron. We've also referred to this as the axon terminal. It actually goes by several names. And the synaptic knob, or the axon terminal, contains synaptic vesicles of neurotransmitters. And recall that the only neurotransmitter that we've identified is acetylcholine. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers released at the presynaptic membrane to affect their receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. They tend to be broken down by enzymes, and if you recall, for acetylcholine, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine is acetylcholine esterase, and then they're able to be reassembled at the synaptic knob for use later. There are two types of synapses: the neuromuscular junction, the synapse between the neuron and the muscle, but we also have neuroglandular junctions, synapses between neurons and glands. When we consider the neuron itself, there are a couple different patterns within neurons. They're going to be listed here. Here's two: the anaxonic neuron, the bipolar neuron. Here's the unipolar and the multipolar. It's almost easier to look at images so that you can really compare. So the anaxonic neuron lacks an axon. There are multiple processes off the cell body, and they're mainly dendrites. Axons are just not obvious, so you can't really differentiate axons from dendrites. The bipolar neuron is one in which you have two processes separated by the cell body. The unipolar neuron has a single elongated process with the cell body located off to the side. And then, of course, the multipolar neuron is the one that we're most familiar with. This is the most common neuron in the central nervous system. And in this, you have a cell body with multiple processes, dendrites, and an axon. Neurons can be functionally classified into three classes: sensory, motor, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are afferent neurons, so they're carrying information. If you consider the brain and the spinal cord, they're carrying information to the central nervous system. They're unipolar. The cell bodies are grouped in sensory collections called ganglia, and their afferent fibers extend from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Somatic sensory neurons monitor the external environment, while visceral sensory neurons monitor the internal environment. For visceral, you should think organ, since viscera refers to organ, and it's going to monitor the internal environment. Motor neurons are efferent neurons. They transmit information away from the central nervous system via efferent fibers or axons. Somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscles. Anytime you see the word somatic, you should think skeletal muscle, while visceral motor neurons innervate smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, glands, as well as adipose tissue. Motor neurons, they receive signals from the CNS to the visceral effectors across autonomic ganglia that divide axons into two classes, either the preganglionic fibers or the postganglionic fibers. And we'll talk more about that distinction shortly. Lastly, we have interneurons. These are mostly in the brain and spinal cord, although you do have some in the autonomic ganglia. And interneurons are located between sensory and motor neurons. Their main role is to distribute sensory information and coordinate the motor activity in response to that information. In addition, interneurons are involved in higher functions such as memory and learning and planning.